Welcome to everyone. Thanks to be here. I am Emma Arguello, and it's a pleasure for me to chair this session that will explore what next after the nuclear security summits process. First, let me introduce our distinguished speaker. On my right, Young-Soo Hwang, principal researcher at the Korea Atomic Energy Research Institute. On my left, Reshmi Kasi, associate fellow at the Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis from India, and Mathieu Coty, research associate of the Non-Proliferation and Nuclear Policy Program at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, IISS. Before giving the floor to our colleagues, I will take 5 minutes to share with you some background about nuclear security in the post-summit era. When we talk about nuclear security, we mean ways to countering the threat of nuclear terrorism and other criminal acts involving nuclear assets. For example, the smuggling of sensitive materials like high-enriched uranium and separate plutonium. These materials that could be used to build a nuclear weapon. These threats have different expressions. For example, the detonation of a small-yield improvised fission bomb in a large capital city, a radiological dispersal device, the so-called dirty bomb, and either conventional or cyber attack to a nuclear facility, for example, a nuclear power plant. And finally, and why not, the theft of a nuclear warhead from a vulnerable storage and a potential attempt to detonate it. The dismantlement of a nuclear smuggling network last year in Moldova shows there is a illicit market alive for nuclear weapons usable materials, and therefore that there are sellers in search of potential buyers. It also highlights the dangers posed by vulnerable nuclear sites in many locations around the world, from which such materials can be obtained, currently in 24 countries. The report entitled Terror Unleashed, sponsored by my organization, the NPS Global Foundation, that will be launched during the Nuclear Security Summit, Nuclear Security Conference, next month in Vienna, shows in black and white the damage that the terrorist nuclear detonation could cause, not only in the target country, but globally. For example, it estimates negative impacts in the global economy at a level at least equivalent to the 2008 global financial crisis, the worst after the Second World War. Multiple layers of international system will be strongly affected, including things so essential as the balance of regional and global power. In the worst scenario, the report shows that the crisis could even lead to a potential use of nuclear weapons by states. The immediate conclusion is that prevention of nuclear terrorism is the only acceptable way forward. Such attack must never happen. While the international community has been pursuing significant efforts to reduce the risk of nuclear terrorism, and moreover since the launch of the Nuclear Security Summits process in 2010, there is broad consensus that the current international security regime falls short to cope the dimension of the threat. Therefore, the needs for its drastic improvement have been central part of the government discussions during all these years, and the expert community has made relevant contribution to such debate. Shortfalls of the regime are very well identified now, and my colleagues sure will address this during their presentations. The high-level political process of nuclear security summits, which came to an end last April after 6 years and 4 summits, has been successful to bring nuclear terrorism as a relevant issue in the global political agenda. But it also has raised some concerns about its lack of comprehensiveness and its capability to enhance the current effort to prevent nuclear terrorism. It is evident that there are many challenges ahead to consolidate the effort done and to set a successful legacy of the summits. In the post-summit era, a key question is how to define and implement a roadmap for further improvement of the current nuclear security regime, but there are many, many more questions. We will be able to address some of these issues during our presentations and in the afterwards Q&A sessions, excuse me. Well, I give now the floor to Yun-Soo Hwang, Principal Researcher at the Korea Atomic Energy Research Institute. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Yong-Soo Hwang from South Korea. I used to work as a Director General for our regulatory body for the nuclear security. But basically, I'm a researcher for the nuclear chemical engineer. I started my career around 35 years ago in the United States. And for the last 20 years, I never talk about anything about nuclear without the slide of a PowerPoint or keynote. So today I'll have some problem because I cannot rely on any PowerPoint slide anymore. That's the order from Matt yesterday. So I'd like to ask one fundamental question. My question is, are we now living in a better and more secure world throughout the 4 nuclear security summit meetings? Probably yes or probably no. We are still facing with a lot of threats throughout global societies. As mentioned by our chair, the 4 successful nuclear security summit meeting create some high-level approach, creating the global platform to share the lessons by way of the center of excellence and some sort of the gift basket in our region. And we like the outcome of the center of excellence, but there are some pros and cons for the future. And as you know, we talk a lot about so-called CBRN activities and cybersecurity issues throughout this conference here in Brussels. But it's still, we need a strong measure against CBRN along with the cybersecurity issues. And also, I'd like to tell something. We so far talk a lot about sub-nation terrorist activities throughout NSS. But we couldn't talk about the problems in South Asia and the Korean Peninsula, about the potential problem of the nuclear bomb development. So that's the real issue for the real society, especially in East Asia at this moment. So before I talk something about the post-nuclear summit security meeting, I'd like to summarize what happened between 2010 and 2016. Of course, we had Fukushima event, and we had a lot of stress tests to secure the safety of the nuclear power operation, and we have a lot of cooperative opportunity to deal with the Japanese colleagues. Sometimes we have a difficulty, sometimes we have some good agreement. And of course, the Fukushima event created some kind of decline of the nuclear energy in Western society. But from the beginning of next year especially, we had a booming of the nuclear energy in People's Republic of China. And also we have a lot of newcomers in the Middle East. That creates a lot of concern about the nuclear security also. Also, as you already know, there is a strong increase about the security tension between United States and the Russian Federation. And also in our region, we have a strong tension between People's Republic of China and the rest of our neighboring societies. But we have some good success for the Iranian deal. I used to work for the Iranian deal for the Director General Dr. Albaradei between 2004 and 2005. I still remember that we couldn't make a good success at that time, but last year we had some good success throughout the JPOA and the JCPOA. And it's a good moment to see the good success throughout the negotiation. And I hope personally that we can have some kind of a similar success to deal with the problem of the North Korean issues. And also, we had a lot of talk about the CBRN terrorist activities in combination with cybersecurity and EMP attacks. And we are dealing with the so-called hybrid event, the combination of the man-made event, such as the terrorist activities, cybersecurity, probably along with the natural event. So what if we have some kind of terrorist activity during the event of the earthquake? It might create a big disaster. And we are dealing with this kind of potential threat very seriously. And also, we are now facing with the IC technology development. The information and the communication technology is booming, and it creates some kind of opportunity to create another security issues. And those are the issues that we should cover for the next phase of the global security regime. Especially in East Asia, Japan, China, and Korea established a center of excellence. And it's a good opportunity to share our lessons with newcomers throughout the activities of the center of excellence. But I have to tell you something. I used to work for the Center of Excellence in South Korea as a Director General. And to me, we need some kind of global and regional approach. To me, we are just copying each other's functions. We are doing the same thing as the Japanese and the Chinese are doing. And we need some kind of a good mechanism to share our experiences and to split the responsibility so that we can effectively operate our own center of excellence. It's not so easy at all, actually. We had a lot of discussion with the Chinese colleagues and the Japanese colleagues, and it's very difficult to have a good common background for the full cooperations. And we actually suggest a lot of good gift basket, especially for the Vietnam. We actually introduced some kind of good mechanism to monitor all the transportation of the radioisotope materials. And we'd like to extend that kind of a gift basket to the newcomers. And as you know, South Korea actually hosted the last nuclear supply group meeting in Seoul. And we'd like to tighten the nuclear security group system because we are facing with a lot of uncertainty in North Korea. And North Korea probably is still relying on some kind of black market to smuggle some technology and information. And we'd like to tighten the system, but it's not so easy at all. And also, we'd like to talk about the physical protection and cyber securities, along with so-called regulatory cooperation among China, Japan, and Korea. And it was not easy at all. I used to serve as the member for so-called TRM, top trilateral meeting for the top regulatory bodies among Korea, Japan, and China. And it created a lot of detailed problems. So even though we'd like to start the joint cooperation to deal with the post-Fukushima event, it was not so easy at all. And also in East Asia, all three countries are developing our own technology for the advanced nuclear fuel cycles. For example, even though Japan abandoned its Monju program, they would like to still work for the next generation fast breeder reactor programs. China is spending a lot of money to develop their fourth generation nuclear power system. And South Korea is working very hard to develop the so-called pyro reprocessing technology. And it creates some kind of tensions. And we'd like to introduce the more strict manner to monitor all the research and development program throughout the region. And we are also working very hard for the nuclear forensic issues. and we are the member of the so-called GCNEP, focusing on detection and the forensic and the assessment technology to prevent any kind of future terrorist activities. So definitely, we need a new approach based upon the experience from the 4 nuclear summit meetings. First of all, we should disseminate the security culture. And it's not so easy to disseminate the security culture to everybody. And we need a lot of trial and errors, how to wisely disseminate the security cultures. And technologically, we should find a better way to integrate so-called 3S: security, safety, and safeguardability into one pieces, so that we can tightly secure our future nuclear facility against any kind of physical activities. And also we have to develop the so-called grassroots approach to strengthen the security principles among all the operators to prevent any kind of insider threat. And also, we should deal with some kind of real issue from the TPR case. Otherwise, people might wonder what we are doing. We are spending a lot of money and effort to tighten the global nuclear security. But if you cannot solve the problem from the TPRK, then what's the real purpose to strengthen the nuclear security, global nuclear security? It's not an easy matter. I have studied the TPRK program for the last 25 years, and they have a very consistent program to further develop all the nuclear bomb and the delivery system. So that's the reason why I joined this European consortium meeting here, to tell you that we need a strong support from the European Union to stop any further actions from the TPRKs. So those things should be discussed in the future, either in the form of the IAEA's leading multilateral approach, or any kind of a bilateral or trilateral or regional or international norms. We need some kind of a defense in-depth approach, as mentioned by our chair. So we have to develop all kinds of mechanisms to strengthen the global nuclear security. And this conference will act as a good opportunity to talk about what can we do to really strengthen the global nuclear security. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I give the floor now to Reshmika.
Sorry for that doubt. Thank you, ma'am. My heartfelt gratitude to IISS and EU Consortium for giving me this opportunity to present my work before you, distinguished audience. And I would begin by saying that I could not but more agree with what my previous speaker just said, that, and he emphasized that there is a need for a mechanism where we can show what, in terms of centers of excellence, both at a regional as well as a global level, the importance of, emphasizing on nuclear security and how we can bring about it. A mechanism is required, and probably centers of excellence is the most viable instrument through which this objective can be achieved. Precisely on that line, I'm going to speak on India's Center of Excellence, that is Global Center for Nuclear Energy Partnership, what it is doing at present. What my previous speaker just said, that centers of excellence should be doing certain activities. I can present it with quite pride that India Center of Excellence, the GCNEP, is already doing much of these activities. This is very much in vogue right now. But before I begin, I would like to draw your attention. Well, we don't have the PowerPoint presentation, but then I would like to draw your attention, as also Madam Chairperson pointed out on the Moldova case, that there is a viable nuclear black market which is going on. And if I can draw your attention to the IAEA incident and illicit trafficking database, I have figures from 2007 to the latest database, unfortunately, the figures in all the four important categories, unfortunately, they have been rising, which emphasizes that there is, as Madam Chairperson pointed out, there is a market, there is a nuclear black market which is still working and which is still looking for potential weak links in this whole chain of nuclear security whereby they can procure these dangerous materials. I have the figures with me, so if anybody is interested, I can always share it with you. And of course, it's available online. So I would begin by saying that, the Nuclear Security Summit, when it ended in 2016, the process, that is, it was a watershed moment. The summit process, though it ended, but it laid the, it established the contact group, which is supposed to take forward the process of the whole agenda of nuclear security forward. And its objective is to develop, the whole objective of nuclear security is to develop an effective and sustainable global nuclear security all over the globe. Of course, much was accomplished to improve and upgrade nuclear security through these 4 summits that we've had, but there still remains much to be done because the threat still remains undiminished, primarily because there are certain wrong people still nursing this malicious agenda of and the desire of acquiring nuclear as well as radiological materials. Of course, there has been, as reports indicate, that demise of AQ chief Osama bin Laden. But then there are newer terrorist organizations like the ISIS have emerged with heightened nuclear risks and even threats. So even though there is no credible linkage linking up ISIS and nuclear threats as such, but there are certain credible sources, some information which makes us, we just cannot be complacent, which is the biggest threat when we are dealing with the issue of nuclear security. So what do we done? A newer thinking is required, and this newer thinking, I believe, can be achieved through the process of centers of excellence. Now, just for the sake of definitional purpose, a center of excellence is an efficient mechanism for promoting nuclear security through regional and national mechanisms. And they are an integral aspect of the global nuclear security architecture for disseminating awareness about the importance of strengthening nuclear security. It is a dedicated institution that imparts training, which is very important. A center of excellence, the primary emphasis should be on the training. The very aspect of importance of training needs to be emphasized at each and every level within a center of excellence, and this is what exactly the GCNEP does. So there is training at various levels, whether it is physical protection, material accountancy, export controls, nuclear forensics, insider threats, and even emergency response mechanisms. And with this objective, of laying the foundation for an improved nuclear security culture, the Global Center of Nuclear Energy Partnership was announced in 2010 by our former Prime Minister, and its primary mission is to conduct research, design, and development of nuclear systems that are intrinsically safe, secure, proliferation resistant, and also sustainable, with the aim of strengthening nuclear security in the future. So the GCNEP is designed to be a state-of-art center of excellence principled upon international collaboration with the IAEA and also other interested foreign partners. It has 5 schools. This advanced nuclear energy system studies, nuclear security studies, nuclear material characterization studies, radiological safety studies, and studies on applications of radioisotopes and radiation techniques. The School for Nuclear Security Studies is under construction, but it is believed to come up. The on-campus classes are supposed to begin from anytime, probably next year, around maybe this time. But even though the site is under construction, they have started holding on-site out-of-campus classes, and I have been privileged to attend a few such courses myself. So the GCNEP, as I pointed out, is a dedicated research and development component under the aegis of the Department of Energy, DAE. And being a COE, the primary aim of the GCNEP is to be an operative forum focusing India's advancement in the field of nuclear safety, security, and improved nuclear and radiation technologies. It has shouldered the responsibility to develop capacity building in technology, training, which is very important, and also human resource so far as the personal reliability system is concerned for a robust nuclear security system. The mandate of the GCNEP includes research by Indian and visiting international scientists, training of Indian and international participants, hosting international conferences, workshops, which as I pointed out, I have attended a few myself, and group discussions by experts on tropical issues. Its mandate also includes design and conduct of nuclear security courses in collaboration with countries that uphold the importance of nuclear security, as well as also, this collaboration is also with the IAEA. Now, as I was mentioning the importance of training, a qualifying edge of the GCNEP is visible in the form of its outreach program, CEL, that actively showcases India's technological advancement in several areas like physical protection of its materials, as well as its nuclear facilities, prevention and response to radiological threats, nuclear material accounting, and also protective measures against insider threats. It also deals with public awareness program on DAE technologies for rural India. And under its guidance, under the guidance of the DAE, the outreach cell has been regularly conducting courses, symposiums, and workshops on issues, several aspects related to the nuclear security. And the course has so far benefited participants from various security establishments by assisting in capacity building through relevant training, both from within the country. These participants have been within the country as well as from outside. Now, the GCNEP has broadened its horizon by developing nuclear security practices, as I pointed out, on safety, on security issues at the international level as well. So in that spirit, it has taken collaborative research and detailed studies from time to time. In October 2004, India and IAEA conducted a regional training course on physical protection of nuclear installations in Mumbai. Such courses are arranged in the form of a module which contains 16 lectures. The number of lectures may of course vary, but this training course had 16 lectures. It had 2 working group sessions. One working group presentation session was of course attended by the course participants. There was also a plenary session, and it also included a field visit to Kakrapar atomic power stations. This course was attended by 25 participants, including 13 foreign participants and 12 Indian. And there are several such courses which have been held. In 2012, India collaborated with IAEA. It conducted an international workshop on safety of multi-unit nuclear power plant sites against external natural hazards in Mumbai. There were additional courses conducted on nuclear forensics. I have attended the workshop on nuclear forensics. It spanned over 4 days. It had about 12 lectures. It had demonstration lecture series where detection architectures were demonstrated to the participants, and the participants were from various establishments, both from within the the nuclear establishment, as well as academicians, as well as from think tanks. So NDRF, the response centers as such. So there were a variety of people, participants that were invited for such courses. My colleague here, he's here. We just had this Indo-UK workshop on nuclear security culture. This is by GCNEP and BARC, and this was done in collaboration with the United Kingdom participants from King's College. So they do circulate course materials like this. There are important topics which are discussed here, and it is very important because it raises a level of awareness about what India is doing, not only within the country, but also for participants who are coming from outside. So I can go on and on, but then there's a time limit. But then I would just like to end by saying that centers of excellence, they are important vehicles for for collaboration. Not only amongst the stakeholders within a country, but also amongst important, like at a regional as well as at a global level. What a major emphasis, a major advantage of a COE would be, it is apolitical in nature. There is, so far there has been no political strings attached. So nations can collaborate at a bilateral or at a regional level without emphasis on any third party, which happens generally in political, situations. So there can be effective collaboration among COEs at a regional level. Probably India and Pakistan, a lot of questions arise on that. But of course, there are a lot of sticky issues. Both nations have to work very hard to effect such kind of partnership, because nuclear security is an important issue that is affecting our part of the world, South Asia, very much. Whether it can be done at a regional level or at a trilateral level by including China also in this kind of a multilateral forum is something which needs to be looked into. And whether the COEs in the form of collaboration amongst the COEs in the region can lead for a regional nuclear security summit. We had regional nuclear security summit at a global level. Whether this process can be also taken at a regional level, probably the centers of excellence can pave a way towards that. As a visiting fellow at the Stimson Center, presently I am co-authoring a project on a project of this nature, and I look forward to your inputs to carry forward my work. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Rashmi. Now, Matthew, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Irma. And apologies to my other two panelists for denying them access to their PowerPoint. I know it's always a controversial thing when I email people to tell them that. But just to remind you that transcripts of all the sessions will be available on the IISS website. So the eagle-eyed among you may realise that I was originally chairing this session, but I am now speaking. So initially, thanks to Irma for helping out, and please bear with me. Just to provide a very brief overview, nuclear security has obviously been a key issue on the global political agenda since the first security summit in Washington in 2010. An initiative very much of the White House and Obama, further summits in Seoul, Hague, and then back in the US Capitol again. And the summits raised broad awareness of the issue and focused high-level attention on national nuclear security efforts. But as this process has now concluded, new avenues for discussion and negotiation are to be adopted, offering new opportunities as well as a number of potential challenges. And one initial point to highlight, I think, is that nuclear security existed before the summit process, and it will again exist after. The issue is now trying to channel the momentum that was generated by the process elsewhere, with the 5 central institutions or organisations identified to continue the job started by the summits. Those 5 being the UN, the IEA, Interpol, the Global Initiative to Combat Nuclear Terrorism, and the Global Partnership Against the Spread of Weapons and Materials of Mass Destruction, or the GP for short. And the different goals, memberships, and internal dynamics of each organisation present a complex policy-making environment for the nuclear security community. So the NSS process was envisaged as a game changer. To a certain extent it was, designed to bypass some of the traditional politics of the NPT process. It was used as a forcing event to channel the power of selected world leaders to push the agenda. Now, I think post-summit process, we're back to an iterative and evolving process, maybe even a step-by-step process, if you will, if we want to dare use that kind of language in the nuclear security environment. So I'm going to speak very briefly about 2 specific issues, and my words will probably be combined in 2 separate sections. The first is on a thorny issue that the nuclear security summit process failed to address, and that's the security of military materials, or all material security. And then I'll switch the focus to briefly look at the role of the EU and what it can do in coming years. So 2 small issues that I'll try and address as comprehensively as I can. So the first, military materials, and this is based on some of the work that Mark Fitzpatrick and I did along with colleagues at CNS and VCDMP. We produced this report. This is the only copy I have with me, unfortunately. It's a bit tattered and dog-eared, but it's available again via IISS website, CNS website, if you're interested, and there will be physical copies available in Vienna in December at the conference, nuclear security conference there. And this was to address the fact that 4/5, or roughly 4/5 of the weapons usable nuclear materials in the world are in non-civilian programs. And that's not only as the explosive core in active or reserve nuclear weapons, but also fuel in naval and military research reactors, HEU and plutonium at production sites, in storage or declared access to military uses, but not yet transferred to other programs or eliminated. And coordinated global efforts to enhance security of nuclear materials have been almost exclusively concentrated on the 17% of such nuclear materials in the civilian sector. Now, the security of materials can vary depending on whether they're used in the civil or military sectors. So, while civil has the Convention on the Physical Protection of Nuclear Material and Nuclear Facilities and IEA Information Circular 225, Revision 5, to outline guidelines for security, no such explicit guidelines exist on how to secure materials outside of the civilian sector. Nor is there a comprehensive public knowledge about the state of security of such materials in all countries with nuclear weapons programs. There's a wide-held assumption that non-civilian nuclear materials are well protected simply because they are under military control. That's an assumption that could well be correct, but the lack of transparency and the number of troubling security breaches at nuclear facilities over the years lead us to question that assumption. Think about the number of insider threats, peaceful incursions, thefts, armed attacks, and most recently, linking back to our previous plenary session, things to do with overflights of drones or indeed cyber attacks and hacking. So I won't go into much detail. Instead, I encourage you to go and read our report. But just as an overview of our recommendations based on the research, which involved interviews with numerous experts and military officials, the recommendations are broken down into 3 sections. The first being advancing efforts in existing multilateral fora, effectively trying to do the best with what we have. The second is extending to all nuclear materials existing mechanisms that currently apply only to civilian materials. And the third is to establish new fora to make use of existing technical or working level efforts to advance best practice of norms. And these 3 efforts are in turn categorized into 4 groups. The first is minimization, elimination, and consolidation. Things like plutonium disposition agreements, which obviously has been in the news recently, the 2018 HEU minimization conference in Norway, or reactor conversion. The second is voluntary application of at least civilian standards to all nuclear materials. Thinking about INFCIRC 869 and 225 Revision 5. The third is exercises, training and sharing of best practices, thinking about the global initiative, global partnership, and the centres of excellence mentioned by my two previous speakers. And the last is to do with transparency and reporting. So here we're thinking about reporting at 1540 level, reporting at the CPP-NM review conference, ad hoc meetings, that kind of thing. Also to mention that the US and UK have started to do this, both at 1540 and at declarations at the NPT review conference. And also another interesting report released this year by the NSS in the US on the stockpile stewardship and management plan goes into a lot of detail about what the US is doing to protect nuclear materials from the military sector. Now, I understand that none of this will be easy, but it is an issue that generally receives broad support, even from certain P5 states, as I mentioned. The question is more how we go about doing it. And again, I think this will be a very slow process, but something that should be considered in the wake of the NSS process. And I'm happy to discuss that in more detail in the Q&A. The second section, as I mentioned, is the role of the EU. and the potential leadership that the EU can demonstrate in this particular field. And since we're in Brussels, I thought it was apt, although I realised that there may be some controversy, as my nationality is a Brit, in trying to talk about EU leadership. But a quick overview about what has been done by the EU, what it could do to sustain momentum. So nuclear energy has long been part of European energy policy, and the EU has therefore acquired a large amount of experience in the fields of safeguards, safety and security. And it's made demonstrable contributions in several interrelated areas linked specifically to the enhancement of border monitoring and combating of illicit trafficking. Think about the Border Monitoring Working Group, or the BMWG, which is an initiative between the EU, the US and the IEA. The Nuclear Forensics International Technical Working Group, or the ITWG, which engages key stakeholders in the area of nuclear forensics and is a world-leading facility. And the group is co-chaired by the EU's Joint Research Centre. The joint US-EU project on illicit trafficking radiation assessment programme, or ITRAP+10, tested and validated performance of commercially available radiation detection equipment against operational requirements to border entry points. And the training programs that the EU has developed for CBRN first responders, likely to be on the front line of an incident, and national experts in detection and identification of nuclear materials. So the EU has clearly played an important role in developing and advancing the technical focus in the nuclear security arena. It's also done a lot in terms of outreach, and this can be seen in the number of projects and the geographical diversity of such efforts. A border monitoring project in Southeast Asia, capacity building assistance in the Democratic Republic of Congo, cooperation on border monitoring in Tajikistan, €4 million worth of money towards the illicit trafficking, combating illicit trafficking nuclear material in the Mediterranean basin. Similarly, from 2007 to 2016, the EU has provided the IEA with more than €118 million worth of support to its activities, codified in a series of council decisions. So much has been done, and much is likely to continue. The opportunities for cooperation with partners are increasing, but resources are finite, and the EU's maybe updated results-oriented focus means that it should identify key projects in a reduced number of locations. So maybe streamline how it supports nuclear security, prioritize states or projects, and maybe adopt certain geographical focus or foci, such as EU neighbourhood or potentially the Black Sea region, something like that. So those are two very brief overviews of two issues that I thought are interesting for the future and sustainability of nuclear security. Just briefly to conclude, I think the end of the Nuclear Security Summit process means that there is now a risk of nuclear security efforts losing some of the momentum generated over the past 6 years. The 4 summits certainly served as a focusing event, or focusing events, and encourage world leaders to consider what they could provide in the form of so-called house gifts or gift baskets, public commitments to improving nuclear security. Pardon me. But while the international summitry will continue in the form of a large event hosted by the IEA in December this year and beyond, discussions are likely to become more technocratic in nature, and representation will be broader, and that's again something we can discuss in the Q&A. Wider engagement is a good thing and addresses one of the chief criticisms of the NSS process. But there is now a risk that substantive discussion of nuclear security will be more diluted, as more diverse concerns will need to be addressed. So consensus, agreement and policies will likely become more of a challenge. And on that positive note, I will end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Our 3 panelists pointed out a very important thing is that how to integrate those countries who didn't participate of the summit process. So the 3 versions of the speech converge to the same point, that is nuclear security should be a global effort and not an effort of 53 countries participating in the summit process. Now we will open the floor to the Q&As. please introduce yourself and point the speaker you want to make the question. Over there.
Hi, my name is Christina Variali. I'm a research analyst at the Royal United Services Institute in London. A question for everybody on the panel. To what extent do you think we need to overhype the threat to keep an impetus, whether that's a political impetus, the impetus for funding for this kind of initiative? How do you balance not being alarmist with making sure that there is a driving force behind the process? And kind of tagged on to the end of that, do we need to broaden the process to be more inclusive? I'm thinking, do we need to also include trafficking initiatives, social initiatives, public buy-in, financial crime? Does it need to be cross issue to make sure that nuclear security is comprehensive?
Thank you.
Thank you. Andrei Baklitsky, Peer Center, Moscow. So for the panel, which is called What Next After the NSS Process, we heard remarkably few things about the institutionalization of this new process, if we are talking about the process. So the summits are over, and one thing which I would also probably would like to hear from this session is lessons learned from this process, and probably not only things which went well, but some of the things which not did terribly well, and might start talking about it, but only a few things. So there is obviously a limit, as we've seen, of things you can do with the coalition of willing, and with all the talks about gift baskets and individual countries' contribution, the whole international community should be engaged in this thing. So the ministerial conferences of the IAEA, which one of those will be happening in December. It's actually not the first one. We already had ministerial conferences on nuclear security before. Going to be the next venue for such things. And there are a lot of talk of how those could be organized. Now the plan is that there'll be one each 3 years. Maybe that's quite a long time. Maybe we might want to have them every 2 years. Or there are also talk about maybe we should do something about nuclear security, in particular at the General Conference. And there is a big question, how do you reconcile the remains of the NSS process, which still continues with these working groups and plans which have been drawn on the latest Nuclear Security Summit with the IAEA track. So if the panel could please comment on some of those, or all of those issues. Thank you.
Thank you. Bernd?
Thank you, Madam Chair. To follow up on this, I think it's good to know that regional centers of excellence are important, but again, they are part of a broader problem along the lines that Andrew just sketched. How can one institutionalize those efforts? You mentioned the contact group. What does this mean in concreto? And also, I think it would be important to get some information of how you would interact with efforts and legislation that is already there, for example, in the UN Resolution 1540. Are there any efforts of close interaction and coordination to optimize the process that I think is sketched fairly vague by you? Thank you so much, but nevertheless for very instructive talks. Thank you.
You and then you.
Christopher Watson, British Pugwash. This is a subject which has exercised British Pugwash for several decades now, and we have attempted to do what has been conspicuously absent in the discussion today, to look at the implications of classification of the information about this whole subject. It goes without saying that people who seriously want to get hold of special nuclear materials are people who will make it their business to get hold of information which is not in the public domain. And if you're going to have discussions among experts, you're going to have to decide which experts you're going to invite and what information you're going to share among all those present, for fear that some of those will turn out to not to be the innocent, altruistic creatures that they present themselves as. British Pugwash's approach to this was particularly focused when the question arose as to what Britain should do with its stock of approximately 100 kilograms of separated plutonium. Now, there are broadly three things that can be done with it. One is nothing, in other words, just to continue to protect it as best we can against such attacks as we think to be likely. The second is, as quickly as possible, to convert it into usable nuclear fuel and burn it up in reactors. And thirdly is to bury it in a deep hole in the ground and hope that nobody's ever going to dig it up again. And we appointed a small panel of experts to look at each of those three alternatives to see what could be done, taking account of not only the information that's obviously in the public domain, but the rather considerable body of information which we possess within our organization, because a lot of us are people who have had decades of nuclear experience in the nuclear industry, so we know a lot of material which is not in the public domain. And our conclusion was that all three of those options had very real problems, but the one which most worried us was the option of, quotes, doing nothing, because that really meant assuming that the protection that we gave to our 100 tons of nuclear materials was good enough. And so we set about devising scenarios in which desperate men who were not afraid of killing themselves in the process could attempt to get access to even a few kilograms of this material and then put it to nefarious use. And the answer is, sadly, it's all too easy, and there are lots of mechanisms which very naturally the people who possess these stores do not wish to talk about in public, because that would merely make it more likely that that information would be misused at some stage. And I think what is really required is to have some mechanism to share information about which experts can be trusted to discuss this matter without it getting into the wrong hands, and which cannot. And I don't see that any of the NSS discussions really went into that or reached any satisfactory conclusion if they did.
We close with this one, and then we have a second.
Okay. Thank you very much. Now, I think I like Reshmi's recommendation. That is an excellent point where she points out that the NSS conclusion basically helps us ensuring responsibility, thereby making it a national responsibility through the centers of excellence, and I think these centers can be linked up with the IAEA. And we in Pakistan have also been able to institute this kind of center of excellence. This has been actually reviewed and assessed by the IAEA teams, and they have actually given very encouraging and positive response on this. And I think these centers have to evolve as the threats evolves globally. And I agree with his point that there should be a global mechanism that needs to actually assess and give information and awareness as the threat evolves. And more significantly, on the second point where Reshmi pointed out that our regional security summit can be actually organized and instituted, I think again at the regional level there is actually huge trust deficit. We have already seen many organizations working at the regional level, but these organizations could not, and summits could not yield any dividends. So I think that is a major concern for the states at the regional level. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'd like to talk about how to set up the framework for the post-NSS. And I trust the IAEA, and whether we have a biannual meeting or triannual meeting or annual meeting throughout the general campus, it doesn't really matter. I think, but we have to be very careful about the IAEA's approach. Somebody might criticize that the decision-making mechanism in IAEA might be too slow. People might think about that one throughout the history. So probably there might be another mechanism to support the IAEA's activities. For example, we might need some strong effort from the UN Security Council to make a swift decision if we really have to make a certain decision. So what I'm trying to say is that we need a parallel approach. Of course, we should support IAEA's role, but there should be another mechanism, global mechanism throughout the UN Security Council, and a lot of regional mechanism to support the other effort. So throughout this kind of combination of the global effort, we can probably strengthen the global nuclear security.
Yeah, thank you. Lots of questions. I'll try to take some of them. Overhype. Yes, these are very important issues when you're dealing with this, with the issue of nuclear terrorism, primarily because it's an unprecedented event. So, and we were having some discussion yesterday. I think we need to be, and I would reiterate, we need to be very careful and restrain ourselves from being alarmist or creative alarmists when we are dealing with the subject. So I guess there should be we need to relook certain terminologies that are used when we are dealing with this subject of nuclear terrorism. We had this discussion on the use of the word jihadist when we are dealing with this terrorist who are looking for such category of materials, because it would be a very self-defeating approach if we are calling them jihadists. They are not jihadists, they are terrorists. And they are terrorists who are looking for this category of weapons, of materials, very dangerous materials. What terminologies in terms of definitions can be accorded to these group of terrorists is something which can be debated further. But it would be a very self-defeating approach to call eulogize them, like justifying their act as jihad or calling them jihadists. So I guess there should be a change in this literature. There should be a change in this terminology when we are dealing with the subject. Lessons learned, a lot of lessons learned from the Nuclear Security Summit. First of all, that on the positive side, nuclear diplomacy can, really bring together a group of nations, and the numbers in all the summits have been increasing. The fourth summit, I think the numbers were at 53. From 47 to 53, though not a phenomenal jump, but then there was increasing participation. So there was the big lesson that was learned that multilateralism is a way out when we are dealing with a global threat like nuclear terrorism. And then there was also an emphasis on certain aspects like safety and security. There has been so far a distinction between safety and security, but then there is a re-emphasis that safety and security, there is an interface. So these are important lessons. One negative aspect that emerges is the communique that has come out, and the other statements that have come out. They are not binding in nature. So I guess some mechanism needs to be developed, and IAEA probably is the most viable instrument in this regard, where the commitments that have been made, they are political commitments. They are that carries a lot of weightage, because these statements are just not like statements per se. They are political statements. They are political commitments. So I guess the IAEA also needs to, of course, IAEA is devoid of political aspects, but then to make these commitments more binding, IAEA is probably the most important instrument through which these commitments can be made more effective. I know there are a lot of problems, as you pointed out, and I would link it to your issue that there is a huge trust deficit at the regional level. But I would also beg to draw your attention to the fact that China and the United States, they have been conflict. They still have a series of issues that differences. That differentiates on a lot of level, at the foreign policy level, military level. They have a lot of differences, but yet US and China have got together and they have issued this joint statement on nuclear security earlier this year. So probably there's instead of having a paralyzing pessimism approach, probably we can look forward and look into ways, devise ways where a robust nuclear security architecture can be effected. Thank you.
Thank you. Matthew, would you like to make some comment?
I would. And there was a lot to comment on, so thank you for all of the questions. Let me start initially by responding to Andre, because I think he was speaking at me. In terms of lessons learned, I think the key one is that it's still, despite the centrality and the importance of the issue, it's still difficult to generate consensus. And this will link to the threat question, which came in a couple of formats as well, and the role of wider politics on trying to come to some kind of conclusion. I think this goes back to the issue of representation and legitimacy. So if we look at, for example, IEA guidelines or the CPPNM or the International Convention for the Suppression of Acts of Nuclear Terrorism, all seen as deemed legitimate because of the process that they've gone through, but questionable in the actual impact they've had. Whereas you think about coalition of the willing style agreements, whether that's GP, global initiative type activity, or simply smaller bilateral kind of activity, thinking cooperative threat reduction, these kind of issues, then arguably they've produced more tangible results in the short term. So the issue is trying to balance, I think, getting things done over broad legitimacy and accountability. On the IEA, in terms of conference, it's a good idea. It's good for experts and policymakers to come and meet. I think now we'll see this issue of nuclear security becoming more technocratic rather than diplomatic. That was the primary function of the NSS process, was to bring together world leaders to try and make something happen. It did that, and now it's effectively up to technical experts to try and then implement whatever commitments have been made. And how to reconcile the remnants of the NSS process? It's a good question. I think the issue is that we still don't know. It remains the overarching issue, and it's possibly not really been addressed. I mean, how do you coordinate the 5 organisations or institutions tasked with carrying out the action plans? Each have different memberships, each have different roles and functions. And again, it comes back to this issue of trying to balance getting things done versus legitimacy and broad acceptance. Another issue, and since you asked the question, is what is Russia willing to do? Because a lot comes down to US-Russia bilateral relationships, and as we've seen, if things aren't so good, then that has an impact on nuclear security. Thinking particularly of the Nuclear Security Summit this year, when Russia didn't attend. So yeah, that's one issue. The other was more to do with threat and balancing hype versus reality, which experts can be trusted, and the amount of information that's available. So there is a huge amount of information that's available simply in archives, if people are willing to go there. There are a number of books which tell you exactly what to do or what you need, where to target certain hypothetical facilities, for example. But I'm confident that, at least in the UK case, and I'm definitely not speaking on behalf of the UK government, but I think that these scenarios are constantly designed and tested. The number of red teaming exercises that take place, force-on-force exercises, and bear in mind that the whole nuclear security system now, via the IEA, is built on this concept of design basis threat. So facilities in particular states will be based on the threat as assessed by security services, military, etc. So the analysis of the threat is certainly very well covered. The issue then relates to how much of that is shared and made public, and whether greater public awareness would generate more interest in the issue. Again, that's an issue for Cabinet Office, effectively in the UK, for example, balancing that public awareness and what to do should a CBRN incident occur versus panicking people. And yeah, I'm not sure I have a great answer for that, but I'm not sure broadening awareness will necessarily directly correlate with more nuclear security activity, for example. I see them as being quite different compared to maybe a disarmament type grassroots initiative. I think they're different concepts. And this broadly brings me on to the final point, which links back to the question about security and which experts can you trust with certain information. I think the sharing of sensitive information is at the very heart of the issue that the report that I mentioned, the research that we're doing, tries to address. As soon as the issue of the security of military materials is mentioned, states generally will clam up. It's not something that they want to talk about generally for a variety of reasons, whether it's by signing up to the NSS process, this isn't what we agreed to discuss, so by now trying to extend the remit, you're effectively going to undermine whatever progress has already been made. Other states are probably worried about any discussion of the security of nuclear material in their country, then leading to broader debates domestically about disarmament, which they're not so keen on having, not mentioning any particular states. So I think, it's all, they all kind of tie together in a, well, they do in my head anyway. I'm not sure I've necessarily explained that terribly well, but particularly on the military material side of things, I think if you can get similarly qualified, similar-minded, particularly military officials in the same room to at least start discussion, then that could be one way of actually making progress on this particular issue. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, just to add to what Matthew just said, on this last point about sharing of information, while the science of safety deals with accidents, these kind of issues, the science of security is more to do with intentional, advertent, cases. So obviously there is a lot of distinction, but so far as sharing of information is concerned, I can understand again on the military materials there is a lot of hitches, but there are certain authoritative people who are willing to share information on issues like less sensitive issues like modules, course curriculum, which can effectively enhance your nuclear security not only in your country but also at a regional level, at a bilateral level. Now, distinguishing between experts who can be trusted or who cannot be trusted, that's a very controversial step. But then there are certain officials, like in India, I can even if they want to remain anonymous, they do want to let you know that yes, they would like to assure you yes that our country is safe. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd like to add something about how to share the information. Actually, sharing the information is very difficult in practice. For example, if you try to have a new build, then you will introduce a lot of digital assessments. So we have to identify what kind of critical digital asset you have to operate the nuclear power plant. And in order to analyze that this component is the critical one or not, you need a profound information about the system. And that kind of information cannot be shared actually by international corporations. Also, whenever you are talking about the aircraft collision by the terrorist groups to the nuclear power plant or the dry storage installation, you need a profound information how to analyze the impact about that kind of accident. And those kind of information cannot be shared at this moment, unfortunately, throughout the global societies. So we need another mechanism how to share that kind of so-called safeguard information to prosper the safe and the secure operation of the nuclear facilities. Otherwise, we cannot go anywhere. So we need a strong effort to share the to create a new channel to share the critical information. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we open a second round of questions. You, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the panelists for giving this their views on the Nuclear Security Summit and the future of this.
Please introduce yourself.
Yes, I'm sorry. I'm Adil Sultan. I'm from Pakistan. Okay. I fully agree with the panelist view that there is need to have collaboration at the regional level and the global level on centers of excellence. As my colleague already mentioned about Pakistan Center of Excellence, so I'll just share this. The IEA had this meeting of International Network for Nuclear Security Training and Support Centers. And for the first time, this meeting happened in Pakistan in March 2016. And the objective was exactly the sharing of experiences and draw a future roadmap, how to collaborate at the regional level, how to have these linkages between the centers of excellence. Maybe it is of use also. I had 1-2 questions, but Matt has already addressed those questions. But having involved in the Nuclear Security Summit process, let me share my experience. While we might like to have some global legally binding arrangement on nuclear security, but this is not going to happen because there are extreme sensitivities involved this, and even while negotiating or having that communique, there were negotiations on each specific phrases for hours and hours. So the practical thing is what the communique in the end agreed to. It should remain voluntary. It should remain at the national level. The responsibility should remain at the national level. Because I agree with the comments made, the moment you bring out that we need to have a global architecture, you will deter more states for engaging constructively in any process that you would like to have at the international level. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you. I think that was an interesting panel. I have a couple of different points. One is to start with the whole process as to how much of did the panelists actually talk about the future of the NSS itself, in that sense, what Andrew talked about in the beginning. But again, I would add that I think the US leadership in this regard was particularly critical in bringing together a vast number of countries under its leadership. Without the US leadership, it would have been far difficult in this particular case in tackling nuclear security. But again, there is also a second reason as to why NSS grew in its sort of support base and so on and so forth. One is that I think NSS, with that, you're actually talking about dealing, every single state is a party to it. Is affected by it, and we are essentially looking at non-state groups as the targets in a sense, and therefore every state has an interest in coming together, talking about it, and therefore I think it's far easier to reach some sort of an agreement, unlike in other non-proliferation issues or outer space or cybersecurity issues. NSS process also is important because it enabled expanding the stakeholder base. For instance, you had the industry summit as well as the civil society experts summit, meeting in a sense on the sidelines of it, which again meant that you are expanding the number of folks engaged in this exercise and who have a stake in continuing with the strengthening of the nuclear security process in a sense. So it will be interesting to see what form it might take in the future. I think it is too important area to be left to informal contact groups within the IAEA, and certainly the IAEA's role has to be strengthened, but there has to be a more streamlined, more strengthened process to continue there after the NSS in a sense. A second point about the whole the regional security measures that Rashmi talked about. I am all for regional security cooperation, but I'm extremely skeptical. And again, regional security efforts are going to be mired in local context politics, and I don't think nuclear security is too important an area to be left to the regional efforts alone. So therefore, you need to strengthen the efforts at the larger global scale in a sense, and I think that's going to be far more important. One last point about I think the last Pakistani commentator talked about global security, legal measures are important but not likely. But in the area of nuclear security, I think you are beginning to see a lot more convergence of interest among states, and actually the CPPNM as well as the amendment is a testament to the fact that global security, nuclear security is something that affects every single state, and therefore there is a greater likelihood of states coming together to tackle this particular problem as against some of the other traditional security issues.
Thank you. Over there, the last.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I entered the room when there was quite a lot of mentioning about the IEA. I'm working for the IEA. I'm Cornel Ferruza. And I wanted to give you a bit of a context. I don't have a question. I only have a comment, if you indulge me.
If it's short.
10 minutes, not more.
No, please.
The comment is the following. I think we may be in a more auspicious context than it appears. And I think the process doesn't start now. It's not artificial. The biggest merit of the NSS is that it placed nuclear security on top of the political agenda. That's great, and we can see already the impact and the implications. The process that started in the IEA with the Nuclear Security Conference, it doesn't start now. It started 3 years ago with the first ministerial conference. It continues now, and it's going to continue for the next years. But in reality, beyond the political layer, I think we have a tremendous work that has been done at the working level, and the context has changed. The CPPNM amendment is palpable now. I think we can try to collect on the benefits of it. More and more countries understand that nuclear security is not only for those countries that develop nuclear power, and nuclear security is not only about the security of nuclear material. We're also talking about security of radioactive sources. And radioactive sources you can find everywhere, in a hospital, and there have been many situations in the last couple of years when radioactive sources from hospitals damaged the health of a number of people that manipulated in the wrong way. So I think the political commitment is there, and the NSS helped a lot. In the IEA, we do have the instruments. I do not share the view that we need to look at something new within the Security Council context, because it's not the lack of instrument that we have. We do have the instruments, we do have the political will, and I think we do have the capabilities. And what is made as a huge difference, if we look back in the last 6 years, we are able to increase the capacity of member states. We trained 10,000 people. It's huge, 10,000 people on nuclear security issues, and we provide the equipment to all of them. So I think we have to understand and to acknowledge this positive development, because that's how we can build into the future. The discussion is more than theoretical, I think. It has to be very pragmatical and focus-oriented. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ali Rashid, Policy Advisor at Interpol, Counterterrorism. I just have a comment about the issue of the nuclear black market that was mentioned earlier. I believe we should be very cautious when we draw conclusions based on the quantitative data that we have in a lot of databases. Indeed, there's been a huge increase in the incidents that are registered and a lot of the databases that are existent, whether it be the ITDB, the IEA, and the Geiger database in Interpol, for example. We're counting over 3,800 cases, nuclear incidents, in the Geiger database in Interpol. However, when we look into the quality of the data, or this, when we do basic analysis, really, with further details, we will realize that a lot of the incidents that are being reported don't naturally reflect this complexity of a black market with huge deals. There's a lot of scams, simply. There is a lot of material being retrieved, and yet that is considered to be an incident. There's a lot of people who are trafficking in everything and they don't really know what they're doing. However, that is registered as an incident as well. So we really need to be cautious not to, in a way, interpret the number of incidents registered in those databases. Another comment about the information sharing. Obviously, that is in a way, the core business of Interpol, sharing information among member countries' law enforcement agencies, sensitive information. It's an incredibly complex issue. We're facing this on a daily basis, whether it be counterterrorism, foreign terrorist fighter information, for example, that is being shared among our member countries. The direct access to these databases is definitely something that is not envisioned simply because of the confidence building measures that we have with our member countries. Simply, countries are not going to give us any information if they have the impression that we are disseminating them the way we want. So every single information we receive has a lot of caveats on it. Who can we share it with? And that needs to be taken into account. If we are to put this issue within the context of nuclear security, for example, we have our relationship with the IEA, and although it's very well framed by an MOU addressing specifically information sharing between the Nuclear Security Department, ITDB, and our nuclear terrorism prevention units in Interpol. We've been trying, this MOU exists since 2005. We've been trying for the last few years to update the MOU in order to be able to exchange more information between the two international organizations. And the membership issue was mentioned by Matt. The two organizations have the same member countries. However, we need to understand that the communities of the representation in each organization is completely different. Obviously, IEA, it's the nuclear scientific commissions, regulatory bodies. Interpol is law enforcement. And that still creates a lot of barriers in what type of information can we share. Part 2, for example, of the country's report. We've been trying to get access to that for a long time. Obviously, there's a lot of barriers, and some countries are objecting to that. So again, it's a very, very complex issue with a lot of sensitivities. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, I have room for a last question and a final comment from the panel. So we have two questions.
Hello, my name is Julie. I'm from the Atlantic Council. I have a question for Dr. Wong. How do we balance localized knowledge and accountability of the implementation of best practices? For example, about safeguards by design, this is relatively new, but how do we actually incorporate this with other countries? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Sitara Noor, and I'm a research fellow at Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. I tend to agree with the representative from Interpol just said that the trend analyses of the databases that actually are coming out from the IAEA and from other sources and some independent databases also, the trend analysis suggests that there is still gap between the supply and the demand. The people who are actually undertaking some events are not actually connected with some objective to carry out something, which is a good sign, and I think this is a point where we should not be over alarmist and not talking about some doomsday kind of scenarios as such. But definitely effort needs to be made so that this gap between the supply, which is being done on without any intention of undertaking some events with regards to nuclear terrorism or something, needs to be expanded. And the being over alarmist, I think, has the counterproductive element of bridging that gap, which should not be done at any cost. And on the previous discussion about the value of nuclear security summits, I think yes, it did not lead to any legal binding measures, but I think we should not underestimate or ignore the normative value that it has established with regards to nuclear security. I think that normative value had created the momentum that led to the ratification of CPPNM amendment. And I think that normative value would actually take states forward in taking more efforts, more measures, which would not be possible by some legal agreements or by binding states in something which they do not agree at the face value in the beginning. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'd like to have a final comment about your question and another question from the voluntary approach. Actually, the information sharing is very difficult, actually. You need a lot of hurdles, but we have to work on that one. So for the safeguard by design information, we have a bilateral agreement between United States and South Korea. It's not global universal compliance mechanism. It's just a bilateral agreement. So we'd like to create some kind of trust building throughout this kind of information sharing with the United States. So what we are trying to is just to introduce the legal binding system between two states to exchange the very critical information. Also, we'd like to promote the so-called T2R3 concept: traceability, transparency, review, reproducibility, and retrievability for any kind of information that could be that can be shared between two countries. So that kind of information sharing mechanism is very critical, but it needs a lot of trial and errors. So as you point out, it's very difficult and challenging task. And also I'd like to mention something about the voluntary approach. Actually, I do not trust any legal binding approach for this kind of actions. We tried a lot of times throughout the history of the IAEA, for example, IPS, International Nuclear Fuel Cycle approach, the regional fuel cycle approach. We'd like to introduce some kind of legally binding system. It never worked out successfully. So we learned something from the previous lessons, emphasizing the value of the voluntary approach. So we have to move step by step. That's my approach.
Thank you very much.
Your final comment? Yes. Well, the future of NSS, on that, to what I already said, I think one important aspect as regards the future of the NSS would be widening the definition of nuclear security. And so far, nuclear security dealt with the protection of nuclear and radiological materials, against threat, sabotage, and other illicit activities. But probably if the definition, this is a suggestion, the definition can be widened to include non-nuclear weapon states as well. Because when we are talking about a global threat, all the stakeholders, including the non-nuclear weapon state, needs to be involved in this, I believe. And so the definition of nuclear security probably can be widened in terms of a future, thought to nuclear security issues. When I mentioned about regional nuclear security summit, I certainly did not mean that it should be hijacked at the regional level. My apologies if I miscommunicated that to you, Raji. But I agree with you that definitely at the global level, more effort should be made to strengthen the nuclear security summit process, and maybe the informal contact groups are there, and more mechanisms can be evolved over the time to make it more stronger. But at the same time, this is a suggestion that probably when we are talking about disarmament, there is a debate that not only at the global level but also at the regional level, states should be contributing in terms of regional disarmament. So in that sense, if every unit, if every stakeholder, when we are talking about nuclear security, every stakeholder should be contributing in strengthening it. So in that sense, at a regional level, states as potential stakeholders facing this threat, if they can also come up with certain mechanisms to improve and strengthen nuclear security, probably it will add to the, definitely that will add to the global efforts as well. And to your comment on classification of information, I agree with you. You have to be extremely cautious when you are using such sources. But then at the risk of being, just as we should not be overhyped, over alarmist, so we should not be at the risk of over cautious. We should not cross the line and become complacent. So the sources that are there, one should evaluate it objectively and to the best analysis possible, and then come to certain conclusions. So there has to be a distinction between overcautious and at the same time, complacency. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. Final comment?
A couple of last comments, if I may. First to Adil, about global legally binding treaty, never going to happen. I completely agree. And if I conveyed anything else, then I apologise. The communique was hard enough to agree on, and I think the central tenet of responsibility being at the national level, again, it's impossible to get past that. But there are arguments that it's something to work towards, so that focus and energy is still devoted to improving standards of nuclear security. So that's one argument that exists for it being there. But I agree, it's idealistic. Raj's point about US leadership, again, completely agree. I think irrespective of who wins the election next week, nuclear security, as a result, will not have the prominence that it previously did. Who knows what President Trump may think about nuclear security. The Clinton administration, if it happens, I'd imagine will be a lot more focused, but not to the extent that the Obama administration was. And I think the very fact that it was so closely tied to Obama, probably for political reasons, that was partial explanation for why Russia didn't turn up, because it was an easy way for Russia to undermine an Obama legacy. To Cornell's point about IEA, again, I completely agree with the work the IEA has done, and the capacity building within member states is hugely increased, and that's a tangible outcome. The issues I was trying to raise is what did the NSS process miss, and military materials is a massive gap in how we refer to a nuclear security architectural regime, and that was the starting point of our research into how we could try and address security of military materials. Certain actors believed that the IEA was one potential forum for that to take place, and we've since realised that that's probably not going to be the case, at least now. So that's just clarification on that point. Very briefly on using data, ITDB data, I think that comes back to the issue of overhyping the threat. Certain data or statistics useful for news stories, but again, actual events contain potentially minimal quantities of material or no material at all. And I like the metaphor of how would you sell a stolen Picasso. It's a similar parallel. Most, if not all, sales or attempted sales end in sting operations, which is encouraging, I think, despite the number of news stories you may read. And very finally, to Satara's point about the establishment of norms, again, I couldn't agree more. I wrote a PhD on that exact topic, but again, it's norms are all dependent on trust and the relationship between states. So a legal underpinning is always more useful if it is at all achievable, which in this case it probably isn't. And I'll conclude there. Thanks.
It's okay. Thank you very much for participating in this session. Please join me to congratulate our speakers about their great job.